Address James Hoffmeier, Professor Hoffmeier's view specifically, because we currently have a couple people who are in the YouTube world that are using his work, or they fall in line with Hoffmeier's thesis on the Exodus. What are your major, I guess if I put like my hand up and said 5 fingers, problems with his position?
Yeah, that's a fair question. So Hoffmeier is a real scholar. He's a real archaeologist, and so he knows what he's talking about. My criticism would be his general methodology. So what he does, and he picked this up from previous, so he's an eminent evangelical scholar, Protestant evangelical, and he picks up his methodology from, I think, one of his teachers, who was Kenneth Kitchen, who was a British evangelical scholar. And Kitchen, I think, picked it up from other people. What they tend to do is they start with the presumption that the Bible is inerrant. Okay, so that's a starting point. It's certainly not the starting point that I start with, or that other scholars in universities, research universities, or liberal arts colleges start with, but it's where evangelicals start. So already you know that
I'm with you.
The inquiry is going to be shaped around the concept of biblical inerrancy. So how do you demonstrate the truth of biblical inerrancy? Well, what Hoffmeier does, and what Kitchen does, and other evangelical scholars do, is they pick and choose historical details of historical realia from texts or from archaeological evidence that in some ways illustrates the idea that the Bible is inerrant. So, for example, if the Bible says that the Israelites built Pithom and Ramses, okay, when they were slaves in Egypt. So people like Hoffmeier and Kitchen will say, oh, well, look, here's evidence that the city of Ramses really existed, and it existed at this particular time period, and therefore the story is true. In other words, it's like in my critique, I would say that's the same argument as saying that, a Shakespeare play about Julius Caesar that has a historically accurate detail about ancient Rome, let's say, they wore togas. The fact that they're wearing togas in this play doesn't mean that the play is historically accurate in all of its details. It's only historically accurate in some of its props. You see what I mean?
Right.
So they're pointing to different details that are like props in a theater production. And they're saying, yeah, let's look at this prop. Yeah, the city of Ramses really existed, and it existed at the right period, so therefore everything else is true. That's a fallacious argument. I could tell you lots of stories that are totally not true, but throw in some props that look real, or that are real. So what Kitchen and Hoffmeier don't do is look at the details that aren't historical. They leave all that out because they're incapable of looking at those details because of their commitment to the Bible being inerrant.
I think you said that really,
This is what they do. And so you can fill a book with little details about, where the city of Ramses was, and what might have been, and what the name of Pithom is actually an Egyptian word, per atum, and you can do all this sort of stuff, which shows that the background detail, or some of the background details in the story, are historically accurate and may even evince historical memories that come from that period.
That makes me wonder, just the loan word question, if you will. How do you address that? Are there biblical loan words? And some people will go, that's clearly a sign. I mean, they're being conquered and ruled by Egypt. So I could see the language being necessary to know in order to cord, well, I
Yeah.
got to talk to you, man, so you got to know something from Egypt.
So
But
this is something
yeah,
that Kitchen and Hoffmeier do all the time too. They'll say, well, look, this word for linen is an Egyptian word. Well, yes, that's absolutely true. Uh, Egypt was, as I said, a major superpower, an economic power. To this day, we talk about really nice sheets being made of Egyptian cotton. Okay, they're expensive. And so linen in the ancient world, I don't know much about it, but maybe the good stuff came from Egypt, and it's an Egyptian word. But that means nothing about any particular story or episode in which Egyptian linen is mentioned. Similarly, a lot of words in Hebrew, the words for ink and pen are Egyptian loan words. Well, that's interesting. And this arguably stems from the period of the Egyptian Empire in Canaan. Every bureaucracy operates by paperwork. And the same was happening in the Egyptian Empire, where you had Egyptian scribes using papyrus and pens and inks and so forth. And so it's kind of natural that the Egyptian words for those things would have been borrowed into Hebrew at the time and became the standard words for pen and ink.
interesting.
So you can infer certain historical processes behind some loan words and things. If loan words are borrowed in a certain domain and not in other domains, you can sort of say, oh, well, there's connection there. But none of that has anything to do with whether the Exodus story in the Bible is inerrant.
I love this. I want
It's
to
a
poke.
disconnect. It's a non sequitur kind of argument that these people use.
What do you say to someone who says, well, Potiphar is an Egyptian name, and the way that the narrative plays it, he has a wife, they have a slave in the house, and it plays out almost like what would really happen in ancient Egypt. Like they know too much. How do you address that?
Yeah, well, if you're talking about a guy who's in Egypt in your story, you want to have a word for the master of the house that sounds Egyptian. You do that today. Let's say in a movie, you've got some, German guy who's a foreigner. Well, what you do in movies is you have him speak with an English accent. And that's how you know he's a foreigner. You have devices to communicate that this is a foreigner. And so in the story, you have the Egyptian master, and so you give him an Egyptian name. Or a name that sounds Egyptian. It doesn't even have to be a real Egyptian name. It just has to sound Egyptian. So if you have, a Russian spy, you name him Boris. Okay, Boris and Natasha. It doesn't mean that the story of Boris and Natasha originated in Russia or the Soviet Union. It just means that you know some Russian names that you give the characters in your story. So it's a meaningless inference. I mean, to say that it's an Egyptian name means nothing in respect to the historicity of the events.
Right.
Because
Just those.
you and I can think of names like that ourselves. I just thought of Boris and Natasha, and I know nothing about Russian spycraft.
Yeah. Or Juan and Lopez, or
Yeah.
something from down in the, some Spanish, right?
If you're an ancient Israelite and you don't know any Egyptian names, then you're sort of an idiot.
Interesting. It sounds to me there's tension there, though. Professor Hoffmeier, do you think that his presupposition of this inerrancy has caused him to view you in a certain respect for that? I mean, it's obvious.
Yeah. You can tell me within that community, if you critique people who are using biblical inerrancy as part of their methodology, you're going to say, well, you're the devil's spawn or something like that. That's part of the discourse. So he's not going to like me. I mean, I don't know why he doesn't like me personally, but he's angry when I say things like that.